So we were talking about how people move up and down on the spiral, and the spiral is not a hierarchy. Now, here's the thing. You go out there and you start talking about something like spiral dynamics, people immediately become suspicious, right? Because inevitably there's some idea that you're using the spiral as some way of increasing your status in the conversation, and you're trying to assert an authority that you have. Okay, look, not my job to control everybody in the world. That's not my deal. Okay, once again, I really want to emphasize these various things. That number one, perceptions versus judgments. We can't make any progress on understanding societies until we can have some perceptions about what they are and what they do. Okay, and some of those things are going to be viewed by people within their own moral compass as either good or bad. We can't control that process of judgment. We can only make the perception, and we can try as best we can, of course, to back it up with data, because a perception that's backed up with data is a much more useful perception than one that just comes from the gut. Not that we want to discount all those either, but basically we want to have perceptions. Okay, and we're not going to limit our conversations. Okay, so one of the things is with the spiral is this inevitable hierarchicalism that goes whenever you lay something down, but that's not the intent that Graves had. Graves or Beck, I mean, basically you move up and down the spiral. And societies can move up and down the spiral depending on the challenges that they face. Okay? So like, for example, one of the things is look at the United States in the 1960s. Well, in the 1960s we had a lot of really wild stuff going on. You know, I personally think, and you look at the history, that we were a lot more sophisticated society in lots of ways in the 60s than we are currently. For example, on the spiral, John Kennedy stood up and said, "We're going to send a man to the moon by the end of the decade." Well, that's very, very orange entrepreneurial behavior. We had a goal that we were going to achieve. We were going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and we did. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Why did we do that? Well, at some level, we did that because we thought it would accelerate our society. But there are also other status-based reasons, because in that hierarchy of countries around the world, we wanted to be number one, and we were in a space race with the Soviet Union at the time. And so obviously we did that at some level because we wanted to be, quote-unquote, better status-wise than the Soviet Union. And a lot of people have made the point, hey, you know what? We went to the moon, that was cool, but we've actually gotten a lot more space science done with unmanned probes. And obviously unmanned probes do not have the same status as putting a man, or now a woman, on the moon. China is right now engaged in a space program, their own space race. China and India both have said, you know, at some level they want to put people on the moon. You know, there's all sorts of interesting things to talk about there. You know, why are they doing it? Well, at some level it's achievement-based, at some level it's status-based, and so it accesses different modes of the spiral. In the 60s, you know, we had the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, you want to think about it, a very globalist, communitarian kind of effort, very yellow-green. The United States branching out, making, you know, trying to make us face a more higher responsibility role in the world. At the same time, we were fighting in Vietnam. We were doing that because we didn't want communism, theoretically, ostensibly, to spread. Okay, that's definitely a very, very powerful red authoritarian mode. We're going to stop the communists in all the little places that we thought the communists were going to come. And that lower level thinking blinded us to what Vietnam turned into. I'd argue that it's a similar kind of thinking that goes on in Afghanistan right now, and was very, very status-based, right? We want to be number one. And what happens inevitably with all these kinds of things is there are all sorts of different reasons, but there are primary modes that societies follow. One of the perceptions that we have of American society right now is that it's very legalistic. Basically, there's all these regulations and all these things that are keeping people from freedom and on and on. Once again, the minute that you say that stuff, there's a judgment mode that comes in. Oh, he must think that that's bad. Actually, you can look at the situation objectively and say, okay, there are some kind of measures that you can have to figure out whether the United States actually is more legalistic than it used to be, or the number of lawsuits increase, the number of laws that people have to comply with. There's just the perception inside the society. A great example to me of how we become more legalistic is just my 10-year-old wanting to take his pocket knife to school, because of the various incidents involving murders and shootings and violence at schools. If you have a pocket knife and you're a 10-year-old and you're in school, you can get expelled. My son's school policy has a zero tolerance for anything that might be perceived as a weapon. When I was a kid, I used to take a pocket knife to school and we'd compare our pocket knives. It was perfectly okay. Now, you could say that this is a cultural thing that is happening inside the United States. But actually what it is, it's really more of a relational thing in how we want to view our society. And that's once again where the spiral comes in handy. Because the spiral says, okay, we move from a more entrepreneurial orange society where we feel like we have some right to do, we have personal responsibility and stuff like this, to a more legalistic interpretation. We're not going to trust any kid with a pocket knife.